the good people using AI in a really unusual, unexpected way are using unexpected AI tools to cause the data to get out, to cause the information to get out.
DORA is a reality. It's here. There's no more grace periods. Everything it needs to be in place.
Financial regulation has been kind of at the forefront. NIS2 is driving a lot of organizations to get their house in order.
Sam, you've spent over a quarter of a century in the trenches of Irish financial services, where you've become a skilled translator of value versus risk. In your experience, when a CEO or CFO is staring down the barrel of a modern cybersecurity risk, do they actually see the value in preparing a strong defense now?
And well, apart from reminding me that I've been doing this for this length of time, yeah, I think it depends. And I think that tends to be the answer for a lot of things to do with cybersecurity. I think in some cases, when it comes to cybersecurity, it is just another risk. So it is about risk management. And if it's about managing, reducing the likelihood of an obvious risk, of a non-sophisticated attack, I think those firms that are proactively thinking about it and they're running this through with a risk lens probably have this nailed. Whereas if they're coming now to thinking about, oh, well, the regulator now is talking about this, or there's an announcement, there's news headlines about a particular thing, and they're only now trying to get their head around it, that usually is a sign that they've been running their kind of cybersecurity preparations through the lens of regulation. So what does the regulator expect? What's the minimum? Regulation drives behavior. I've seen that myself. But the problem with that is you're always kind of playing catch up. So you're catching up with what's the attack, method going out there? What are the threat actors doing? Because you're focusing so much on, well, what is the regulator talking about? But the regulator, in a lot of cases, they might be talking, the words are on the page, and you kind of talk about your regulatory compliance in terms of the letter of the law. What is the specific sentence? Whereas if you take it back into, well, what's the spirit? What's the underlying concern that the regulator has? And how can we address that? Then I think you're coming at it from a better perspective, because you'll be looking at it from the true risk perspective rather than from a regulatory compliance perspective.
And what has been your mission in all of that?
My mission, I suppose, is, my background is IT. I started out as a software developer and then managing software development teams, managing IT projects and new system implementations. But all the while, it has not been within an IT company. It's been within a normal company where normal people work and they're trying to do their normal jobs. So all the way through, I suppose, my career, it's been trying to translate the gobbledygook, the tech speak of IT and cybersecurity into language that normal people can actually comprehend. And what I've learned is over time is when you are talking, especially to financial services firms or business owners, when you put it into perspective of risk, then at least you're having a normal conversation with a normal person, because they get the idea of risk. They get the idea of the likelihood of something, the impact of something. Now, you can certainly be in a debate and sometimes ecumenical discussions about what is the true likelihood of something and what is the true impact of something, but at least you're able to talk to people in non-technical terms. And that's what I have found is, from my time working as an employee of a financial services organization and then as an independent advisor, when you're able to talk to normal people about IT or cybersecurity or data protection or any of those fun things, in terms of what are the potential risks to them personally, professionally, and also to their organization, then you're in a much more meaningful conversation and you start figuring out together where they prepare to draw the line in terms of what risk is acceptable and what risk needs to be reduced or mitigated.
So if I kind of wrap that up, helping organizations understand the risk of cyber, essentially, that has really been the core of your mission, but more importantly, educating them around what those risks are potentially going to be in terms of likelihood and impact.
Yeah, I call it information security without insanity. Because, when you start getting into like cybersecurity and then it's straight into, well, it's firewalls and it's multi-factor authentication and people just glaze over. You know, whereas if you're just talking about it in terms of it is a risk.
Of tools or layers and
Yeah. And actually, when you look at, you know, things like ISO 27001, the international standard, or you talk about all the different frameworks and standards that are out there around cybersecurity or information security, a lot of the most effective controls are nothing to do with technology at all.
Yeah.
And you can have the best technology in the world, but if the human operating the technology doesn't know what to look out for and clicks yes and accept and authorize to every single prompt that comes their way, technology is not going to save you. So when you talk about it in terms of risk, you're able to bring in not just what's the likelihood of something going wrong, what's the impact, but you're also able to talk about, well, what are the things we can do as humans or as an organization, or even in terms of our physical security, what are the things we can do to reduce the likelihood of that or reduce the impact of that?
In a recent article, you introduced a concept that I really liked, which is the conflict between FOMO, fear of missing out, and FORE, the fear of rushing in. And although this wasn't necessarily in cybersecurity, it was in AI, but it had the same kind of lens, which is the risk potentially for financial institutions on rushing into adopting AI, where other industries are actually rushing in. So FORE seems to be winning out in terms of your view, but is that potentially kicking down the road an even bigger risk?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of fear of missing out, everyone understands it. And I think with AI companies in particular, I mean, they're making big bets in terms of data centers and NVIDIA chips and things. So
yeah.
they're signing big checks and they need to get the income to cover those checks. So it is in their interest to get a lot of positive stories out there about how other organizations, how your competitors are doing more, how you are being left behind. And if you don't do it today, tomorrow's too late. So lots of industries are moving very fast in that area because their competitors are moving. Financial services firms, you know, in my experience, they are naturally risk averse. The regulator is naturally risk averse. So all of these kind of big steps into the future around AI need to be taken in an informed way. You know, what are the risks? Have we got ways to mitigate the risks before we start throwing our customers' data in there, before we start relying our key business processes on AI? And I think what you have then is your fear of rushing in. So, and that fear is well placed, because if you look at all of the kind of the trends, so like cybersecurity and information security and AI, you know, people talk about cybersecurity, and that most of the time that means in people's minds a bad guy breaking in.
Yes.
Information security is kind of broader, which is about, it's just securing the information. So it's not just about the bad guy breaking in, it's about the good people making a mistake and the data getting out.
Yes.
So that's cybersecurity versus information security. And I think AI in 2025 was very much about the bad guys using AI to break in. Whereas all of the surveys and my experience would be what's going to go wrong in 2026 is not really that. It's going to be the good people using AI in a really unusual, unexpected way, are using unexpected AI tools to cause the data to get out, to cause the information to get out. So whether it's a bad guy going in to steal the information or whether it's a good guy doing something to cause the information to go public, that is still a security breach. The security of information is gone. So the fear of rushing in is a real thing, and it is well placed. And I think what financial organizations and risk averse organizations need to do is to decide if and when they're making that step in AI, and a lot of my clients would be doing Copilot with Microsoft 365. When they're doing that, not just to roll out the tool and think about, well, how can our staff be more efficient? But also, how can we roll out the tool without causing some kind of an information security breach? So what are the technical things and non-technical things we need to do to just reduce that risk so it's worth the step in?
So 78% of employees bring their own AI to work already.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a strong likelihood that 78% of the bank employees already bring their own AI to work, again, within certain constraints, right? So I think the lack of fear of adopting AI is creating a bigger risk of shadow AI. Mm-hmm. So I think that is also a reason why you really should be rushing in, because if those tools are already available on their phones and for free, remember, they are the product then. So there is a strong argument to actually say we should be actually rushing out the rollouts of AI into the organization to bring down the likelihood of the use of shadow AI. Would that not be a stronger argument?
Yeah, and I suppose I wouldn't call that rushing in. I'd be calling that again, it's risk appropriate. So what are the risks? As you say, the risks right now, if you've done nothing with AI, your staff are doing something with AI.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like anyone that has seen what happens if you record a meeting and let AI summarize the meeting and pick out the action points will know that it is worthwhile. I mean, it'll hallucinate and
Yeah, of course.
and unfortunately assign actions to you, which is not, not the intended outcome, but it is a useful tool in terms of personal productivity. So people, you're dead right, people will use AI. The question is, it's not to rush in for an organization to say, how do we make sure people only use the tools that we want them to use? How do we make sure that if we can technically block them, we do? And if we can't technically block them, that we block them through policy. So at a minimum, the staff know if they use a tool that hasn't been approved or doesn't meet the rules of the organization, there's a disciplinary side to that. So they're exposing the organization to a risk that's not acceptable. At the minute, if there's nothing written down in terms of what the staff are allowed to use, then they're using whatever they like. And as you said there, if they're using a product which they're not paying for, which is highly likely, then the likelihood is the product is the staff member and the data that they're feeding in. So that's a very simple breach of security whereby someone loads up, organizational information that's potentially confidential or at least internal, loads that into a tool that they're not paying for. That tool now is using the information for other purposes. That is a very simple data breach.
Using policy as a control is a pretty weak control mechanism.
Yeah.
Especially when you're talking within a digital framework, because you physically can't see most of the work that is actually being done as an output. 9 times out of 10, it's normally meetings and then minutes of those kinds of things. So you normally don't actually get to see how the sausage was made within that process, fundamentally. So I think one of the mechanisms of using an acceptable user policy is, again, a little bit short-sighted. And correct me if you feel that this is wrong, but my feeling is it should be almost inverse. So you have an AI strategy sitting at the top. The AI strategy almost dictates what technology can be used and how it is used. You almost force that rollout and you give all of essentially the mechanisms of the various processes. So whether it's listening to meetings to generate minutes, to create actions, or summarizing documents, or organizing your email box, or whatever the case may be, but you essentially create all of those tools and available, and you say, right, you've now been given a palette of all of the colors that are available to you. Paint whatever picture you want, now go. And I think that as an acceptable use policy would make much better reading and much better enforcement, because it allows people to do more than what they ever were able to do before. Because I think AI is completely different to cybersecurity and GDPR or privacy in that mindset. I don't know if you agree.
I don't think in the sense of LLMs and things like that, I don't think this is a new world. I mean, this is a tool that's being deployed, and potentially your confidential information or your sensitive information could be loaded into the tool. So in this context, shadow AI to me is a subset of shadow IT. Yeah. I get your point around the acceptable use policy. An acceptable use policy that says you can't use AI is not much of a policy. So you're right. I think if an organization writes a pragmatic acceptable use policy to say you're allowed to use AI in this way, these are the tools you're allowed to use, these are the contexts that you're allowed the tools in, this is the notice of the transparency that you need to give people. So for example, some organizations would say, yes, you can record the meeting so that you can do your transcription and your summarizing, but you can only do it if you've told people you're going to do it and you've given them the option to opt out or whatever it might be. So there's a transparency bit there. And that's, to me, not just a legal thing. That's just a professionalism thing. Yeah. If I join a call with somebody and there's an AI note taker sitting there, it's a tool. And depending on the conversation, it doesn't really matter. I'd prefer if I was told in advance so I was ready for that. So an acceptable use policy that is about acceptable use, not a prohibition on use. But an acceptable use that says, these are the tools you're allowed to use, this is how you're allowed to use them. Then I think that, in a way, is defining your initial AI strategy. That is not a 5-year AI strategy. That is your couch to 5K strategy. That is how you get off your ass and do something. Exactly. So the fear of rushing in is you got to do something, right? So, maybe you're thinking your competitors are going to be running a marathon, with AI in the next 3 years, and you need to be up there. Well, before you started running the marathon and rushing in, make sure at least that your people know how to get from the couch to 5K. And I think the acceptable use of saying, well, how do we think, what do we think is a reasonable way to do this? And what's the time frame? So do we think that this is only a 6 month thing? and then we need to go further? Or do we think this is what's going to do us for 2026 or 2027? And maybe it's about saying, well, where does the industry go? What does the central bank talk about? What did the regulators talk about? What do our industry peers talk about? So in a way, it's like, yes, lots of other people are in the bleeding edge, but we don't want to be in the bleeding edge. But we don't want to be complete laggards. We want to be somewhere in the middle. So an acceptable use policy might be a poor man's version of an AI strategy, but it gets you started.
Yeah, I like that. Poor man's strategy.
Real man's strategy.
We need that for the sound bites. Okay, so there was an idea when I was reading over your blog. You came up with this really cool idea of the clumsy Smurf. So the clumsy Smurf is a well-intentioned character, but if left to its own devices, it basically will wreck anything. So if you think about AI left to its own devices, roaming around unsupervised in a regulatory environment, I get why the financial sector would really have an issue with that. But how should firms potentially be babysitting the next evolution of AI and AI agents, and potentially in the future, AI orchestrators?
Yeah.
So I know this is a bit of a future type question, and I know it's quite niche, but what's your thoughts in terms of preparing the scaffolding to support that idea?
I think it does go back to the idea that, this is think of it as a marathon piece, and a lot of firms need to get off the couch and get to the 5K piece, which is just about getting everyone comfortable to use the tools, and the organization comfortable that while everyone is training themselves, that they're not exposing themselves to some kind of issue. I think the AI agent piece is that idea that an agent is not just doing, Q&A, it's not just talking, it's not communicating with the human. It's actually going off and it's got agency. So it's often doing things on behalf of the organization. And the experiences of firms that have tried that would be that the AI agents are very eager, but they're also very thick. So they don't get, what a human would do after 20 years of growing up and going to school and going to college and doing exams. They would understand when they're instructed to do something, the guardrails to do that. Whereas an AI agent may not necessarily understand what a human would say is common sense. So organizations find themselves with AI agents that go off on, complete and disregard what the original instruction was. And then, you point it out to the AI agent and they'll either say that they were never told that or that they were told that, and I'm really sorry I did that. So I think AI agents will get better. I think the guardrails will get stronger. And I think organizations need to be thinking about where they're going to put these AI agents in. But if the humans that are going to be operating and instructing the AI agents aren't comfortable using the AI tools themselves, then the humans won't know how to control those AI agents and avoid the common risks around that. And then, so it's kind of like everything else where it's about maturity. So the organization needs to get to a level of maturity with their own staff and their own comfort level and skill, so that when they get to the next level where they have these AI agents operating instead of or alongside humans, the humans have an idea of how these things work and where they can go wrong.
Yeah, staying with the idea of agentic tool sets, we are now starting to see agent browsers or agentic browsers that are coming out. Now, right now, they're still more personal toys. I don't see that being in necessarily the enterprise network in the near future, but I think that could be a potential. But looking into your crystal ball, how do you think businesses will manage this from a security perspective, right? Because firstly, does this mean or spell the end to BYOD? Because for all intents and purposes, this laptop could have an agent on it and be operating. So how would organizations deal with that? I mean, I know it's another future question, but looking into your crystal ball, does that spell the end?
I think BYOD, enabling people to use their own devices to access company data is without appropriate technical controls and human controls it's a bring your own disaster, because, whatever about iPhones and Androids, if you have no confidence as to how someone is managing the security of their device and your data is accessible on that device, then if you go back into language of GDPR about being a data controller, you can't demonstrate that you've got control over the data because you don't have control over the device that has access to the data. So if you have unmanaged, devices that are being used, and then you put an AI agent in on top of it, that is just some recipe for disaster right now. Because yes, there are these agentic browsers, but if you look at how the news stories around those, on Monday you'll get a news story about how fantastic they are and how productive they are. By Wednesday you'll get a story about how they've just completely destroyed somebody's, either code base or data or folder structure or whatever. And also attackers are realizing that AI agents are great because they are eager and they're stupid. So rather than targeting the humans, they're now targeting the AI agents, and they're fooling the AI agents into carrying out instructions. And humans can tell the difference between an instruction that a human gave them and an instruction that was hidden in a web page, whereas AI agents can't tell the difference. Yeah. It's as simple as that. And those who know the technology would say they will never be able to tell the difference because of how they process information. So to me, that whole agentic browser piece, I think let's just keep an eye on how the bleeding edge people get on with that before we start bringing that into an organization. And if it is being brought in, to put it in a sandbox that says, if this thing goes completely mad, it is physically impossible, technically impossible for it to break out of here and get to the crown jewels over there.
Yeah, for me, when I start seeing that kind of stuff, it makes me quite nervous, because exactly what you were saying around the protection layers that we need now between the agents. And I don't think we quite have the architecture mapped out, at least not to my knowledge, in terms of how you would actually start to segregate that out. So the way that I'm thinking in terms of old school would be you would have your network infrastructure. Inside your network infrastructure, you'd have your DMZ, your firewalls. Inside that, you would have your network layers of protection. So your tipping points, your packet level inspection. We're almost going to have to re-architect that for AI and AI agents and the AI orchestration layer above that, in terms of being able to almost intercept each one of those commands and connections that are coming in. Where is it coming in from? Is it a trusted source? What is the context of it? Are we expecting it in that way? That is what I'm seeing coming down the line. I think there's been some attacks against the against the
API layer.
The API layer. And I can't remember the acronym now, but basically it's against the API layer. That's where the core kind of attacks have been. But I almost feel like that the layer up is going to be coming quite soon.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, attackers, AI agents, to a degree, the way that they log into systems mimics the way that humans log in. So they're given an account and they're given permissions, and they're able to do whatever those permissions enable them to do. And you kind of go, well, if an attacker can fool a human, and if the percentages are, an untrained human versus a trained human, then how do you train the AI agent to be as strong a defender as the humans are? Because you can train humans to watch out for the common things, making them aware of how people are being targeted on WhatsApp or through SMS or through email. Humans get better, right? They are a very strong defense, and they are able to kind of adjust their defenses as threats emerge. The AI agents nearly take things at face value. So someone knocks on the door and says, hello, I'm here to collect the post. Yeah, no problem. They open the door, and it's like having a 5-year-old controlling the door of the office. I don't know where it's going to go, but I do think it's, in the world of, when the internet came along first, and, I would have spent a lot of time building, the secure websites or the secure portals that clients would have used to log in to see their bank balances, or, millionaires would have logged in to see their investment portfolios. And we were aware of, by putting that information online, it was becoming closer to attackers. So as much as we might have a millionaire and all their financial information, that would be very valuable for an attacker to get at. So we had to obviously put in security controls to say, well, how do we, reduce the risk of an attacker getting in? But we also had to think about, well, if it's an attacker does get in there, then how do we make sure they can't go any further and get into our systems and everything else? So while it would be embarrassing for us to have to tell, our millionaire clients, oh, by the way, an attacker's got in and seen this information that's been put on the site, they haven't been able to get in and divert your investments to somewhere else. Yeah. So back then we called that, DNZs, demilitarized zones, or silos or sandboxes. So the online, the kind of the more exposed systems were put over here. And while the internal crown jewel stuff was able to go up, there was no way for the information to come back down. And that meant that if an attacker got in here, which is in this new world is where the AI agents are, then that you have controlled it so they can't go further. So in a way, you might allow the humans to go further, the humans that are trained and they understand the threats. I think in the short term, the AI agents will be put in a sandbox which says, if this all goes badly wrong, we know the blast radius, we know how bad this could get. And while that could be bad, at least we know the crown jewels are safe. You could end up with copies of data, multiple different systems that seem to be doing the same thing, but one is over here that's a bit more exposed than there. That to me feels like how you take on the kind of the potential benefits of an AI agent while also, protecting your crown jewels.
So old school DMZ,
You know,
segregation of duties.
yeah, I mean, like back to the thing of, absolutely having a human policy is a weak control because a human can either accidentally or maliciously choose to disregard the policy.
Yeah.
And technical controls, if they are good controls, they will 100% of the time work. So if you have technical controls between your crown jewels and where these eager but stupid AI agents are, then that to me is a very traditional, old school, probably costly way of doing it. But at least you've got that DMZ. There is a separation.
Yeah. Moving away from the crystal ball thinking to a little bit more now. So DORA is a reality. It's here. There's no more grace periods. Everything it needs to be in place. So when you are working with organizations in the financial services sector that rely on global SaaS giants, what is your pragmatic approach to ensuring that those vendors don't become the biggest compliancy liability for those organizations, right? So what's your thinking around that?
I mean, there's obviously a concentration risk around the big SaaS providers. I mean, everyone uses Microsoft 365, so there's a massive concentration risk on 365, and every organization has to decide whether that's a risk that they're prepared to accept or whether they go somewhere else. I think the larger players, they're a nightmare or impossible to engage because they don't want to engage with clients unless you're massively globally scaled. But at the same time, they do have their security centers and they do have the documentation. And to a degree, you go, well, as one entity, as one organization, how much more could we possibly do? Right. So there's a piece of that. I think where the trouble comes in is when you go a tier down. So you go down to a SaaS provider that does something very important to you, but they don't have the level of maturity or resources that a Microsoft or an Amazon or a Salesforce has.
Yeah.
And now you've got a very critical supplier. So true risk to you that does a very valuable thing, probably embedded in your critical business processes.
Yeah.
But they don't have that organizational maturity around risk management and information security risk management in particular that you as a regulated entity have.
Yeah.
And that's where I frequently encounter the biggest problems when I'm helping regulated firms. It's not really the regulated firms that have the problem. They understand what regulation means. They understand what regulatory compliance means. They understand risk management. They understand governance. They go to a non-regulated entity, a mid-tier or smaller, and they don't have that maturity. And they potentially don't have the resources to get to that maturity without a lot of pain. Now, DORA forces the regulated clients to insist on these providers to do more. But these providers, it still surprises me how some of them, and IT managed service providers as well, they just don't seem to have got it yet. So I think the biggest challenge is when a regulated entity uses an unregulated SaaS provider or third party, and that unregulated third party, the regulated side of their business, the regulated client book is only a small part of what they do. So the majority of their clients aren't regulated. They're getting all this noise from the regulated clients, but they don't see this as being an existential risk to them because most of their clients are not regulated. And then you just get this block. So the regulated clients are saying, I've got a regulatory requirement to get these things in the contract and go beyond that. I need to demonstrate, I need to know you're doing the things in the contract. And the SaaS provider or the third party is going, yeah, I mean, we can sign the contract, but like, evidence? What are you talking about? So I think some third parties and SaaS providers are getting it, and they're going, you know what? If we want to stay in the regulated space, we got to do this, and there's a cost to it, and they need to pass that through. That's just the nature of the world. Yeah. Others, if they don't get that soon enough, they're going to have to make a decision. Are they staying with regulated clients, or are they going to turn? But with DORA, DORA's hitting firms that have been regulated for years. DORA is just coming on top of central bank guidance around cybersecurity in 2016 and Operation Resilience and outsourcing in 2020, 2021, whatever it was.
Yeah.
and even DORA's coming in on credit unions in a couple of years. So even the smaller ones are coming. So anyone serving those clients has no choice but to realize this is going on. A lot of them are saying regulated clients are just too much of a pain in the ass. Let's turn. And then they turn around and they realize NIS 2 is coming to all the other ones. So you've got health providers and you've got, essential entities and important entities. So if you've got, power utilities, health providers, even some charities that might be regarded as being within NIS 2, those unregulated service providers getting hit there as well. So it's just the nature of the world that regulation flows down. Mm-hmm. And while financial regulation has been kind of at the forefront, NIS 2 is driving a lot of organizations to get their house in order. Now, those clients, those firms, I've been helping them because I suppose my experience in financial services, they're saying, well, you've seen the future for us. We are a healthcare provider, we're a health service provider. We can see that what's coming to us is what's been in financial services for so long. So they aren't necessarily at the same level of maturity as regulated financial services firms are, but they're going to be, they have to be. And then in turn, their challenge is going to be hitting their third parties. And back to your original question, I don't think it's going to be the tier one SaaS providers that are the challenge, because there's only so much you can do there. I think it's the mid-tier ones, because you're expected to have more control over them, but they don't have the maturity to answer you.
But how do you, again, more from a philosophical question, instead of leveraging out the multinationals and almost kind of shifting hard-earned euros outside of Ireland or into these multinationals, supporting local businesses. I think there is a good place for the regulation, but I think that might actually create some bottleneck or some hesitance to take on slightly smaller organizations because of that maturity piece. So I think there is an opportunity there potentially for the likes of Enterprise Ireland or other organizations to support smaller SMEs actually improve on their security. What's your thinking around that? I know it's maybe kind of outside of your thought process, but
yeah. Well, I mean, if I help, these service providers or SaaS providers, a lot of time they come to me asking for help around ISO 27001, which is kind of, it's a risk management process for managing information security. But a lot of the regulated clients, the first question in their security questionnaire is, are you certified to a recognized security standard? For example, ISO 27001. So those SaaS providers are kind of going, okay, well, look, they see the future. They see this is it. And the way they see it is every new prospect, every time they go into a due diligence with a prospect, it's, okay, well, let's have a look at your financials. Let's have a look at your other risks, and information security comes up. So a lot of them are reading the tea leaves and they're seeing this is coming. If it hasn't already come, this is coming. And I think they are getting where they're export focused or there's an export opportunity, they are able to get support from Enterprise Ireland or equivalents, because they're recognizing this is just the cost of doing business. If I'm going to have financial or regulated clients, if that is my target market, I need to have the things in place that will make us look like less of a risk to our target market. And something like ISO 27001 or even, cyber fundamentals, which is what the cybersecurity centre in Ireland is kind of pushing, or within Europe is even pushing now, what would have been cyber essentials coming out of the UK. Cyber fundamentals is not quite the same as 27001, but again, it's a recognised framework. And I think that's where the smaller or the mid-sized Irish service providers need to think about. If they are saying their target clients are enterprise grade or regulated grade, this is just the cost of doing business.
Yeah, memory serves me right. The standard is CIFUN.
Yeah.
Which is based on NIST.
Yeah. So, I mean, as much as CIFUN is kind of like, no one's ever heard of that. Well, in Belgium, it's been around for quite a while, but they've aligned it to NIST cybersecurity framework, which is well known, come out of the States, well known in cybersecurity circles as being kind of, well, if you don't have ISO 27001, have you at least looked at this NIST CSF? So if you've done any kind of work in that, then switching your focus into cyber fundamentals, or CIFUN as it's called, isn't a massive deal. It's not a big deal. But right now, there's no way to get an independent certification piece of paper that says you align to it, but that is coming. And that might be less onerous than getting certified to ISO 27001, which is quite expensive in terms of auditing, your pre-certification audits and your yearly audits and things like that. So it might be an alternative if an organization is saying, well, I don't want to get certified to 27001. And I haven't seen too many regulated entities certifying to 27001, even though they expect their service providers to get there. So there are ways to do it. What I would always say to an organization is if they're trying to get ahead of the regulation, look at standards or frameworks that are out there that are written by industry bodies like the ISOs or the CIFUNs, the NIST cybersecurity frameworks, and try to align yourself towards that, because that's telling you what good looks like. So if or when something goes bad, and things go bad, despite best efforts, and you're in front of your clients or you're in front of a regulator, you're able to have, you have a defensible position, and you're able to show honest efforts that you did what you thought was the right thing to do. And if you're putting it through a risk lens, you're able to say, well, the reason why we didn't address that risk, which turns out to have been the cause of this issue, is because we were focused on this risk, which I think you will agree was a higher risk. And at least then you're in an honest discussion and you can show honest effort. And the outcome of that kind of regulatory discussion is less painful than you kind of going, well, I was just looking at subclause 5.2 in your thematic review. That's all I was worried about. And I hit that baseline. Like, that's the floor. That's not the ceiling of what you should be doing.
Yeah. I love the idea of a defensible position, because that's really what you need to be looking at when implementing any one of these frameworks. But the way that I see 27001 is it's almost like a firm handshake. As in, I'm here, these are my standards, these are my values, and when there is a crisis, there is a set process in terms of how we will address that. Because that's one of the fundamentals of an ISO, is that whole incident response and capability.
Yeah. I mean, like, ISO 27001 is talking about having a reasonable information security management system. But I turn it around and say, what it ensures is you have a system to manage information security risk. It is a system. It's not dependent on the individual heroics from you or from me. If I'm on holidays, the system should still work. If I leave, if I get hit by a bus, the system should still work. It's defined. It's just a matter of someone or something operating that system. So it is about, back to that whole language of maturity, it brings you up to a level of maturity that you are managing the risks.
So I've got a wider question just around the framework. So we've also got 27701 and 42001. So these are acronym soup numbers that mean very little to most people, and no one should really take too much notice of them. But 27701 is around a privacy information management system, and 42001 is an artificial intelligence management system.
Yeah.
Now, do you see the same adoption from kind of broader industries? Because these are, again, internationally recognized standards that carry certification, that really carry that firm handshake that we actually take cybersecurity seriously, we take privacy seriously, we take AI governance and the governance of that technology seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think 42001, which is the AI piece, I think if you're already 27001 certified, then going into 42001 is not a massive step, because it is just about, again, how do we manage the risks? But the risks are more about the AI risks than they are about information security.
Yeah.
I think, again, back to my point, I think regulated firms don't really look at 27001 for themselves. They expect their service providers to look at it. And in the same way, I would imagine that they're going to start expecting their service providers to have a statement around how do they manage AI risk, because everyone wants to know, well, how are you using AI and what's happening to our data? There's also, just like we talked about the NIST CSF, there's also the AI CSF coming out. So they all kind of are sisters of each other. And if you're doing the information security one, then the uplift to do the AI one isn't a massive deal. So I do think, as you say, a firm handshake, having the certification is very useful. I just find it's very interesting that regulated firms expect their providers to have that certification. They don't necessarily decide to do that themselves.
So quite recently, we had the Jaguar Land Rover breach event that kind of showed what happens when a major organization like that is hit. It basically cripples the supply chain that leads up to that. And that failure basically cost £1.9 billion. What do you think the financial sector is taking from that particular breach?
I think there's an element of the Jaguar one is similar to any other breach in a way, in that it's, okay, they were attacked, they took down systems. As a result, Jaguar weren't able to run their production lines. So there's a piece of operation resilience, there's a piece of, your cybersecurity defenses. I think what's unique about the JLR one is the realization that suddenly this idea of supply chain risk is a real thing. But actually it flipped it. So in the past, financial organizations would say, what risk do they present to us? Whereas with Jaguar, what it actually presented to the UK government was, what does their client's issue present in terms of the risk to its suppliers, and the small suppliers who might have had to lay off staff, shut down, whatever it was. So the supply chain runs in both directions. So I think for financial organizations, it's about thinking not just about your third parties, but also about your clients. If you're in a B2B world, what could happen to your clients that could cause a serious problem for you? And, obviously, if they don't pay their invoices, then that's a problem. But also, if they have an issue, could that cause an infection, a knock-on effect to you? Could them being breached cause you to be breached? You see it with kind of invoice fraud, email account compromise, where an email account is compromised. And really, the impact on that company isn't really massive. The impact is actually on those who receive the emails, because they're more likely to be fooled by the emails coming from there. So I think the Jaguar one is interesting in that it made, I think, people realize, operation resilience and supply chain risk is a real thing. And the idea, as in NIS2, about important entities and essential entities, whether anyone ever thought a car manufacturer was an important entity or an essential entity, now suddenly it was having an impact on the livelihoods of people that worked for companies that weren't Jaguar. And I think suddenly now that broader sense of you're an important entity because you pay for other people's jobs suddenly brings other people into scope for current or future regulation.
Last question. Looking at the remainder of 2026 and into 2027, what are your cyber predictions?
I think we kind of touched on it earlier. I do think the risks around AI will continue to reveal themselves as people rush in, AI agents and agentic browsers are things we talked about. I do think on an information security perspective, I do think executives are quite rightly moving from a worry about outsiders using AI to get in, and worrying about insiders using AI and either accidentally or maliciously causing things to go out. I think that's where the focus is moving. At least all the industry trends and surveys would suggest that. And back to what we discussed, I think, reasonable steps need to be taken to reduce that, to at least acknowledge how these things can go wrong and what we can do around that. And it's because for those organizations that haven't started on their AI journey, they have to start it this year, because they will be behind. If you're talking about AI agents and they haven't even got into the idea of using Copilot or Gemini or whatever to just do personal productivity, if other people are looking at the bleeding edge and they're not even looking at the stuff that came out a few years ago, they will fall behind and they will have trouble keeping staff who know how these tools work. So I think, even the most risk-averse organizations will be making that step. And I think they're quite rightly concerned about, well, when we make that step, what are the things that could go wrong? I think that's where suddenly information security will now broaden out from a focus on cybersecurity and the bad guys getting in to being AI is actually causing the good guys to cause data to get out.